when you were listening to that, that sort of introduction that Katrina gave us, what we hear is an American Shakespearean, yeah? And in a sense, there's a bit of a tension in that, isn't there? And in some ways, that's kind of manifested in your history publication, that there are some books that are very much about Shakespeare in England, and then the others.
There's a great divide in my work from the first, let's say, quarter century, in which I immersed myself in 2 years, 1599 and 1606, and tried to read everything written in those years as an outsider.
Sure.
And one of the things that was exciting for me about 1599 was, as an outsider, realizing that Shakespeare scholars had excluded Ireland from the consciousness of Elizabethans, whereas it was pretty obvious to me that Ireland was everyone's nightmare at that time, Queen Elizabeth's especially. So it was my outsider status that allowed me to, I think, see things in a fresh way. And I think I might have continued either writing books about single years or establishing a franchise and selling to others the rights to do other years. I'm kidding about that.
Not a bad idea. Yeah.
But with the election of Donald Trump, that was no longer something I was comfortable doing, since I felt that as a scholar, as an historian, I had an obligation to tell the story that spoke to an America that was shocked and battered by the political changes we were experiencing. So I set aside that long work. And I'd written one book in the middle, a book called Contested Will, Who Wrote Shakespeare. But the book is really about when did smart people begin to believe in conspiracy thinking?
Right.
Because I was feeling at the beginning of this century how pervasive conspiracy thinking was. And one of the strangest things that ever happened to me as a scholar was, after that book was published, I received a letter from a Supreme Court justice who didn't believe that Shakespeare was Shakespeare. And
the Bacon theory,
which is mind-boggling, because they decide the law of the land, and sadly, this last year especially, we can see the fruits of that. He'd recently retired from the court, and he wrote to me saying, you know, Shakespeare's signatures are wobbly, he must have been illiterate. And I wrote back saying, that's funny, because you didn't even sign your letter, and your secretary typed it. To have had your career as a functional illiterate is extraordinary.
Sure, that went down really well.
You can still do that in America without getting locked up, but I would not recommend it in the coming years.
So all that led to this book, Shakespeare in a Divided America. And I want to talk a little bit about that as a way of getting us into the Federal Theatre Project, because you started with a very particular Shakespearean production in 2017 in Central Park. And I think that production perhaps would give us a way into the Federal Theatre Project and start to think about how Shakespeare and how theatre interacts with a democratic society.
Sure.
Could you tell us a bit about
I'll give you the very brief background to that. When I'm not stuck in an archive, I'm working at the Public Theater in New York, which even right now, this summer, is doing free Shakespeare in Central Park and has since 1962. So 50 or 60,000 New Yorkers line up in the morning, go to see a play in the evening, and get a little Shakespeare in their lives. And some of the greatest actors on the American stage and film have performed. And immediately after Trump's election, Oscar Eustis, who was the artistic director of the Public Theater, decided he was going to do, yet again for the fourth time in his career, Julius Caesar. And he was going to do it with a Donald Trump lookalike as Julius Caesar, big red tie. And the New York audience kind of shares your political disposition. So when this Trumpian Caesar came out, the audience loved it, went crazy. And until the moment when largely a group of actors of color assassinated this Caesar. And a right-winger took a still shot of that It spread to Fox News, and then people were being paid by the right to come and disrupt the show. And little did I know when I finished this book that this was merely a dress rehearsal for January 6th and the attack on the Capitol. So there's a way in which theater can capture and bottle what the forces that are going on around us. And that to me is very scary, very exciting, and my job to in turn capture and bottle.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that strikes me with your reading of that event is the way in which Oscar Eustace, very, very smart man, well used to dealing with audiences of all kinds, misreads what's happening. I mean, that he in some ways doesn't get what the battle is. Is that fair?
And that's exactly true. And he is as shrewd a theater person as any. One of the complicating factors was that as the artistic director, with a pretty, at the time, unlimited budget. We'll get to that later, I hope. He planted in the audience, in this modern dress production, 50 people who, when the assassination happened, started getting up and jeering the conspirators. Because he didn't want it to be simply, he wanted people to think about the consequences of acting on your desire to terminate somebody who was anti-democratic by anti-democratic means. The problem was you had fake resistors and then real resistors. So audience members didn't know who were the plants and who were the actual right-wing agitators who were rushing the stage, tackled by security, and led off. And it was one of the scariest theatrical experiences I've ever had. At one point, I couldn't take the pressure, and I got up to walk out. But I meet the profile of a Trumpian, a white male in his 60s. So security went to tackle me, and I was lucky one of the guards knew me, so I wasn't hogtied and dragged off. But this points to, again, what theater can show and what theater people miss, which is just as important as you rightly note. Yeah,
and I think, one of the things you point out is that production of Julius Caesar, by putting people in the audience who were protesting the assassination, does what theater does, which is sets two forces in opposition to one another. That when we go to a play, we commit ourselves to seeing two things in opposition. And that what the people who were genuinely protesting the play saw, that was only the one side. They only want to see the one side.
And I don't think theater can exist, or democracy, for that matter, can exist if the two sides don't recognize that these are positions that collide and clash, and in a sense are mutually destructive in that collision. So for me, it's very important to think of theater and democracy as twin-born in ancient Greece. And when one is sickly, the other is going to be sickly. So my work now is about trying to understand, not necessarily provide a cure, but maybe diagnose something that is fatal in American democracy right now.
Yeah, and that fatal is a word, that word fatal is a word that gives me pause, because when I was reading this book and you come to the last page of it, and I'm just going to read a little bit of the last paragraph. You start off, the future of Shakespeare in America, like the future of the nation itself, would appear secure. No writer's work is read by more Americans. But then you go on to say, well, one side no longer sees value in staging plays, only a threat. Things can unravel quickly. It happened before. In the early years of the 17th century, playgoers of all walks of life crammed the Globe Theatre, turning to the plays of Shakespeare and his fellow dramatists to understand their fast-changing world. And then you go on to say, by 1642, there was a declaration that all, quote, stage plays shall cease, and the Globe, along with London's other theatres, was closed, then torn down. And I went to turn the page, waiting for the uplift, the but, and I get the acknowledgements. It's a very downbeat ending to this book.
Well, I take the elevator to a lower floor in the next one.
We're going there.
And for those who will read that book when it comes out next June, this will seem like an uplifting ending. Simply because of the distance my nation has traveled in that time, really, as opposed to yours.
Yeah. And in some ways, I mean, the Shakespeare book is about that prehistory of the present, and the Federal Theatre Project book is also very much that prehistory of where we are now. I mean, I know Katrina gave us a bit of background on the Federal Theatre Project, but perhaps for people who might need a bit of a
I knew very little about it. Just, we're in the theater, so we know of one or two of those productions.
Yeah.
But
and one of the plays you mentioned in the Shakespeare book is the Orson Welles, The Voodoo Macbeth,
exactly.
37.
And that's the most famous production, the greatest hit of the Federal Theatre Project. Franklin D. Roosevelt, president in the 1930s in America, is a progressive, and he believes, as I believe, that the health of a nation depends not simply on business and agriculture, but on the arts as well. And after a successful campaign for re-election in the 1930s, he decides to create, as part of a post-depression, or really post of the worst of the
really, deficit.
Unemployment's still about 20% or so, and so many young photographers, writers, painters, musicians, and people in theater are unemployed in a kind of post-COVID way. So he decides to create what's loosely called Federal One, which is a relief program in which artists in all these fields who've lost their jobs and want some form of employment are given a minimal amount to live on and join these projects. So the Federal Theatre Project was handed over to somebody quite like you, a professor of theater. God forbid it were me, but somebody who is sensible and understands how to create something and build. And Hallie Flanagan was a professor of theater at Vassar College in New York. She had been one of the first women to win a Guggenheim Fellowship, had come to Europe, Ireland, England, Scandinavia, especially Russia, to study theater, and came back fresh and full of ideas and introduced it into her experimental theater in Vassar. And she had gone to school with one of Roosevelt's right-hand men, Harry Hopkins, and he picked her to run the Federal Theater. And overnight, she was given 12,000 workers, Arthur Miller, Orson Welles. These are very young artists, and countless others. Burt Lancaster, who I probably won't mention in the book, is part of the circus, because that's part of the entertainment.
I didn't know that. I did not know.
Amazing, amazing talent. And in the course of 3.5 years, her organization, from coast to coast, stages 1,000 productions, seen by 1 out of every 4 Americans, 2/3 of whom had never seen a play before in their lives. And the cost was a pittance, just a quarter or 50 cents or less.
So to put a number on that audience, we're talking 25, 30 million.
We're talking 30 million Americans out of 123 million Americans at that time. And across the classes. And it was extraordinary, because they're not only doing Shakespeare or Moliere or Shaw, but they're also doing plays on very particular topics. I don't know how many of you were here at 11 this morning and heard the great session on housing and the difficulties right now facing the housing crisis in Ireland. But there was a housing crisis in the States as well. And Roosevelt, in his second inaugural address, talked about how 1/3 of the nation was ill-housed. So what does the Federal Theatre do? They decide to create a play called 1/3 of a Nation. And it begins with something you should never begin with. The play opens with a house on fire, a tenement on fire. Which
you save that for Act 3.
Scared the bejesus out of it. And it was staged in every city that the Federal Theatre had roots in. In Philadelphia, the problem was buildings kept collapsing. So their opening was a building collapsing on the stage, which was tricky because the Walnut Street Theater itself was so shaky, the stagehands weren't sure the entire theater would not collapse at that moment.
Yeah.
But my point to connect it to this morning's session is, it's one thing to have 100 really engaged people in a room listening to some really smart people talk about the housing crisis. But imagine putting on a play that 250,000 people would see and think, my God, we have a crisis. Let's do something about it. And elected officials started coming to these plays, and before they left the theater, started doing the mental calculation. If I want to be reelected, I better start fixing housing. So that is a pretty good example for me of the ways in which theater can galvanize and correct and improve a democracy. And that was a great, great production.
And what they call the living newspaper. Really is kind of one of the foundations of documentary theater, isn't it?
The big secret for the for the Federal Theater was that it had socialist and communist roots, the idea of agitprop theater. And the nice thing about these living newspapers, which was a kind of, let's dramatize newsreels. Let's take the news and stage it. And it tended to be progressive and left because they were dealing with all kinds of exciting subjects like syphilis or housing or power or utilities. And yet people rushed to see these plays because it was what mattered to them. And you could stage a play with 150 or 180 actors. This was not star theater. This was scores of actors engaged in a play. And it began to put pressure in the political realm on those who, for one thing, did not want to see black people on stage, especially those alongside white people and interacting with them.
Because that's another aspect of it, isn't it? That they had what they called the Negro companies.
They had what they called Negro companies from Hartford to Seattle, which was an attempt to give a chance to black artists that had been denied them. The Civil War is living memory at this time for the aged, and it was...
and going back to the Shakespeare and Divided America, where you look at the history of Othello. How long does it take before Othello was actually played by a black actor?
Longer than it is here, by a century. So America had a great deal of difficulty with that, and the first mega hit for the Federal Theater was a production that had 150 black actors, directed by a 20-year-old Orson Welles, produced by Houseman. I mean, and it was a brilliant, brilliant political production that then was put on a train and taken as far as Dallas, Texas, where they were not used to seeing black people do Shakespeare. So this really was terrifying to people on the right who were white nationalists, who believed in segregation, who did not want their culture to be examined or changed. And the more successful the public theater was, the more terrified and panicked those opposed to its progressive, liberal vision of America were.
Which brings us, and Texas is a nice kind of link to this, which brings us to the establishment of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. In 1937, is it established?
38.
38.
38.
Yeah, early 38. And it's chaired by a fairly unknown congressman from East Texas.
I don't know if there are anybody from East Texas here, but it's good old boy country. And not only are black people not allowed to vote in Texas in primaries, which basically elect the Democrat who's going to be in power, But even poor white folk can't be, because there are what are called poll taxes. You get to decide whether you're going to put food on the table or you're going to vote. You have to pay for one or the other, and most people, push come to shove, are going to put food on the table. So you get politicians who are put into power who are protected as they run again and again and again. And one of the most unscrupulous and most dangerous politicians America has ever produced was a man named Martin Dies. And he believed in anything that he needed to believe in to climb up that greasy pole and attain power. And he managed to get himself placed as the first head of what was called, at the time, the Dies Committee, but was technically called the House Un-American Committee. And the word we now use is woke. Anything or anybody to my left is woke, as Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump or tens of thousands of wannabe American politicians to the right now believe. In those days, it was un-American. And when this was discussed in Congress, people stood up and said, wait a second, this could be used against anybody who disagrees with those in power. Nonetheless, politicians were so scared of being considered un-American that they voted for an un-American committee. And this House Un-American Committee decided to go after low-hanging fruit. And there was no lower-hanging fruit than the federal theater.
Because I mean, it was originally set up to find out was fascism and communism infiltrating
exactly. And you're having Nazi rallies in Madison Square Garden. You're having stormtroopers march in New Jersey. The country was scared of a communist takeover, although there were never more than 60,000 communists in all of America. They were afraid of fascism. And this committee was just to kind of gauge. And this was a short-term committee. It was given just 7 months to gather its findings. And Martin Dies said, I want a permanent position in which I can keep expanding my power. And the Un-American Committee in the House, the more famous one in the Senate with Joe McCarthy, is a different story. But the one in the House lasted until 1975, creating havoc on the left. And there was this moment, the key chapter in my book is there was actually a congressional hearing, where Hallie Flanagan and Martin Dies confronted each other and debated on the record, for the congressional record, the place of theater in a democracy. And here you have ultimately those two positions. One of their governmental entities, the Federal Theater or the Un-American Committee, is going to survive the year. And the other is going to last for 40 years. And it was a federal theater that was destroyed and shuttered. And Martin Dies, one of the least intelligent, most savvy politicians I've ever read or certainly written about, figured out. So what this is, not to oversimplify, but I'll oversimplify anyway, is this is a story about how the right can destroy progressive, democratic values, and how on the left, infighting among various more left, and more cautiously leftist groups cannibalize and devour and destroy each other, even as the right is swallowing them up.
Which is why I wanted to start with that 2017 production of Julius Caesar in Central Park, because in some ways Oscar Eustis is in exactly the same situation, where he thinks, okay, this is about debate. Right? I'm opening up a debate, and you give your view and I'll give my view, and then we'll have a debate. And what he doesn't get is that the people with whom he's debating, debate is the problem. They don't want to debate.
Exactly.
And in some ways, that's what happens with Hallie Flanagan, isn't it?
It's true, and it's funny. I love Oscar Eustis, and he's a dear friend. And if you ever meet him and ask him to open up his wallet, he will take out his mother's red Communist Party card from the 1930s. He truly is a communist.
Yeah.
Hallie Flanagan is this Midwestern creature who always sees two sides to everything and is perfect, therefore, for running a federal entity like the Federal Theater. But both of them struggle to explain how theater works, going back to your earlier argument.
Yeah.
You know, she's not going to say, here's Hegel's philosophy of fine art. He uses Antigone to show that the forces of Creon and Antigone collide.
Yeah. Here's how dialogic art works.
You can't do that.
Yeah.
That doesn't work.
Yeah.
So how do you explain to somebody who sees what you're doing as the enemy, as horrifying? How do you explain that this is actually how drama works, and it's dialogic?
Yes.
And she can't do it. She fails to do it, as I think we would fail to do it.
Yeah, I'm sure we would. Yeah, because we're trained to debate.
Yes, and to respect the position and to move somebody. So what happens when that dialogue ends? Theater ends.
Yeah.
And what happens when you remove theater from the culture? And my argument, and it's pretty obvious to me, is, and I'm seeing it in America right now, and one of the most disheartening things as a theater person in America today is theaters are closing left and right.
Yeah.
And smaller communities first, and mid-size, and even now in New York, the major theater institutions are downsizing. And to me, that just means democracy in America is downsizing.
Yeah. Let's go back with Hallie Flanagan, though, for a bit, because I want to kind of play shamelessly to the local Galway audience a bit. That when Hallie Flanagan, before she heads up the Federal Theatre Project, she gets a Guggenheim, of course, to come to Europe to study European theatre, and she comes to Ireland. And she goes to Dublin first, and she realizes, no, Dublin's not where it's at. And then she goes down to visit Lady Gregory down in Coole Park. And she thinks, oh, this is where I'm really going to find out what's going on. So, I mean, Lady Gregory, in her journals for October 1st, 1926, speaks about a nice little woman who arrived today, Miss Hallie Flanagan. But what's interesting is that Hallie Flanagan stays in touch with Lady Gregory. And later on, and this is December 29th, 1926, she talks about a letter she's had from Hallie Flanagan from Moscow. And she says, this is what Hallie Flanagan writes to Lady Gregory. I have lived in the various exciting theatres, Stanislavski's, the Second Art Theatre, the Kamerny, and above all, the new and amazing revolutionary theatre of E.V. Meyerhold, who is evolving a drama made of wood and steel to match the proletariat civilization. Theatres every night for the past month, yet Russian theatres such infinite variety that one never tires.
That's great. I
didn't
great. Know that.
Yeah,
That's wonderful.
And of course, in her book, In Search of European Theatre, she really enthuses about the theatre in Russia. And she makes the argument that where medieval theatre took its energy from the Catholic Church, and Greek theatre took its energy from the gods, that Russian theatre is taking its energy from communism. And it's interesting because Lady Gregory gets the book, and she actually has Barry Fitzgerald read it to her, the actor Barry Fitzgerald. Barry Fitzgerald is down visiting Coole, and she gets Barry to read it. I mean, you know, but she writes this to herself. A victory for the workers, the enthusiasm born of it. I understand that. But when it dies down, I wonder what will be left for enthusiasm. The divine cut out, rejected. Or will the divinity in the soil be yet recognized, acknowledged? I wonder if the Russian church has ever had a counterpart to St. Patrick's hymn. In stability of earth, in steadfastness of rock, I bind myself to God's strength to pilot me, God's wisdom to guide me, God's host to save me. She says, I think they had looked on the Tsar as God, embodiment of force, of power. And when he fell, the visible power, is it not strange that they lose faith in the invisible? That's Lady Gregory writing to herself.
Fabulous.
She was great.
That's fabulous.
Yeah.
And you capture, or Lady Gregory captures, and you shared with us part of the tension Hallie Flanagan felt.
Yeah.
Her attraction for a theater of the people, of agitprop, of theater that could reinforce social change, if not revolution so much as a more modest social change. And of course, when Hallie Flanagan, appears before Congress, the nuance that Lady Gregory captures here is lost. So Hallie Flanagan had written about a certain Marlowe-esque sensibility, and one of the congressmen who hears that says, "Who is this Marlowe? Is Marlowe a communist?" And
that's a great line.
She did something out of character, which, like everybody else in the room, burst into laughter, embarrassing a congressman who had a lot of power over her at this point. She went on to explain he was, a contemporary of Shakespeare, and he still didn't get it. Well, was he a communist? And in his obituary 30 years later, that was the lead. People were still laughing about him.
Marlowe's a communist.
That, is Marlowe a communist was the tag. But he then shifted to, well, forget about Marlowe. Mr. Euripides, is he trying to enact social change? And what the argument between the congressman and Hallie Flanagan turned on was, can you do theater without trying to challenge the status quo? And the answer really is, whether it's Aristophanes or Shakespeare, you can't. And once you see that, then you're acknowledging that theater is dangerous. Because it can mobilize audiences, some of whom may not be literate, some of whom may not follow the news or only listen in a silo to one kind of news. And it underscores how much is at stake in something like the Federal Theater Project or any national theater.
I mean, I keep going back to that time when she's in Russia. I suppose a bit like Martin Dies did, but I keep going back to it in her book, In Search of European Theatre. Because on one hand, she's fascinated how the Russian Revolution has actually facilitated theater. And she talks to somebody who says, in 1914, there were 210 theaters in Russia. In 1920, there were 2,000. And she says, well, how many are there today? And the person she's talking to kind of shrugs and says, we can't keep count.
Wow.
That they're coming up every day. And she's there in like December of 1926. Lenin dies.
It's the 9th year of the revolution.
Yeah, Lenin had died the previous year, I think 24, Lenin dies. Russia or the Soviet Union invades a bit of a neighbor, a bit of Afghanistan in 25. Trotsky's sent into internal exile in 27. I mean, it all sounds horribly familiar. A Russian leader moving toward autocracy, becoming an autocrat, having a bit of a foreign war, getting rid of the internal enemies. And she's there right in the middle of that. And she sees the theaters.
Kind of like Oscar Eustis, she sees what she needs to see and wants to see. She's there with blinders on to try to find a theatrical culture that is not as moribund as the American theatrical culture, which since the beginning of the 20th century had been utterly battered by the movies. And the movies had almost completely displaced theater. In the late 19th century in America, every small town in America had a theater. And by 1920, they were almost all shuttered. Touring companies destroyed. So she's looking at Russia not fully understanding, because she's not a political creature, she's an academic. She's not looking at where this is heading politically, she's looking at where it's heading theatrically. And the really original kinds of work. She goes to London and hates everything she sees in London because it's self-congratulatory in a way that for her the Russian theater was not. But boy, was she raked over the cold for her visits to Russia.
And it's fascinating, her account of the Federal Theater Project, that wonderful book Arena that she writes. I did a quick search, and she mentions, I think, Russia 7 times in 350 pages. She just doesn't want to talk about it.
No, and when she's asked, where does the living newspaper come from? Oh, it just comes from over there somewhere. She's just terrified of that.
Yeah.
And she was destroyed by this. She was hospitalized late in her life. She developed, she got ill, and she started hallucinating that in the hallways outside of her hospital room were those calling her a communist and members of the Dies Committee still getting her. So the drama entered her own mind, and she felt that she had been an utter failure in trying to promote what she did. And I don't think she was a failure. Personally, I think the failure was in an America that had a choice at that time. It wasn't the war that ended the federal theater. It was Congress that ended the federal theater and would never allow another federal theater or a kind of scheme that you have developed in Ireland of late to fund artists and writers at a time of financial crisis. Our countries are moving, at least in my lifetime, in opposite directions in this respect. And I try to imagine as best I can, although I think alternative history is best left to novelists.
This is I was going to push you on. I mean, could Hallie Flanagan have played her cards differently? I mean, or is that even a fair question?
It is a fair question. And as I sit and read her book, Arena, and as I go through the day by day of her struggles to keep in check the radical communists in her group, who are some of the smartest people, to, I mean, there are plays that are crossing her desk that she knows she should stage. In the very middle of the enterprise, 2 young black playwrights, Abram Hill and John Silvera, come up with a great idea. They're going to write a play called Liberty Deferred. And it's going to be the history of black folk in America. And it begins with a scene with 2 young black people dancing, watching 2 young white racists talking about what they know about black people, all the stereotypes. And the black people, young black couples say, it's how are black people imagined in this country? It's the movies that shape how we're seen. It's theater that shaped how we're seen. We're not like that. And in the middle of this amazing play, it's manic. There's a scene called Lynchotopia. And in Lynchotopia, which takes place in a kind of afterworld, all the black men who've been lynched that year come to Lynchotopia. They're all having a noose around their neck. And there's a contest. Who has the best lynching story? And they all kind of compete to win Best Lynch Victim of the Year. And they're telling their stories. And, oh, you were blowtorched? That's really modern. I like that. You know. And this is on Hallie Flanagan's desk. And she realizes if she allows this play to be staged, the blowback at a time where Congress the previous year had just said, we're not passing a law outlawing lynching in America. No how. What are the limits, in other words, of progressivism? How far can you go?
I mean, and even in contemporary art, I mean, we've only got that far with a novel like The Trees, Everett's The Trees, which is about
exactly the same story
of lynching victims coming back. Wow.
So
and they didn't do that play.
They kept deferring Liberty Deferred
they deferred it.
until the federal theater ended, and they were kind of promoting another black play in which the argument was, well, blacks first enslaved each other, so it's really not our fault that black slavery exists. I mean, if Ron DeSantis had read that other play, he'd have a much better argument than the one he's promoting now, that slavery teaches slaves skills, so it's kind of a positive.
Right.
No, one of the scary things is kind of going back and forth between the 1930s and now, and seeing how much, you know, I'm going to call the book Playbook, because the playbooks of Hallie Flanagan are set against the playbook of Martin Dies. And the right-wing playbook was formulated in the late 1930s, and it is still being used to defeat what I would call a kind of modest, progressive, democratic agenda. So it's not that I have to persuade people like you that theater is important. It's that I have to persuade people like all of you that if you care about democracy, you have to care about a vibrant theatrical culture.
Because it's, and you say that they're born together.
And inseparable in that way.
Yeah. But how, and I go back to that, you know, that for me, shock ending of Shakespeare Divided America, where you say, look, it has happened before that theaters have been shut down, and then end of book. How does theater, in a culture like a divided America at the moment, how does it defend itself, preserve itself, make sure that, you know, it doesn't end up like England in the 1640s?
I think many of the problems that the 1930s brought to the surface are honestly problems right now. For example, and I don't know how this is going to work itself out, the Black Lives Matter issues in the States brought to the fore the extent to which theaters are operated and run and directed by whites, and the need for greater representation of black actors and directors. Part of the problem in the United States is those who subscribe to theaters and keep them afloat tend to be old white folk. So at a certain point, what happens when those old white folks say, we've had enough Black Lives Matter, we want something else? So you have really cogent arguments for diversity colliding with, I'm tired of that. That's not what I want to pay for. So the conflicts within the larger culture are being played out within theaters at a time where many of them are struggling to make it. And there is no substantial government support. We have a National Endowment for the Arts that just throws a few cents here and there to support theater. And it's been challenged by Reagan, and Newt Gingrich and Donald Trump have all tried to gut it. So even the leavings of what the government support is for theaters is not enough to sustain it. So the answer is, I'm worried.
In some ways, that's a bit of a catch-22, though, isn't it? That it's that the reason the government support isn't there is because it's not a popular thing to support for a substantial part of the population.
And it's not there to support because it hasn't been made part of people's lives. And the beauty of the federal theater was it cost nothing. The government decided that people deserved theater, and people deserved theater that spoke to where they lived and was, you know, this is a time where not many people were university graduates, not large numbers of immigrants within this culture, and it became a force for cohesion. And one of the great things about the federal theater was that it formed coalitions with thousands of church groups and went into hospitals and orphanages and asylums, began working with those with disabilities, so that theater became more than I'm going to a show and spending 20 quid and having a good time. It became a glue that held society more firmly together, and, going back to what you were saying earlier, allowed people across an ideological spectrum to share something and to engage in a conversation.
That dialogic piece.
If you don't have that, you don't have the fabric of a democracy.
There was a piece in the New York Times about a month ago by David French, who, of course, lives in Tennessee part of the year, and he talks about, you know, going to Donald Trump's rallies. And he says, you know, one of the things that so much commentary on Trump and Trump's rallies misses is the kind of the joy at these rallies, how much fun they are. I mean, is that a kind of form of theatre that is hitting a whole part of the population that is somehow or other a more progressive theatre has to try to match? Or
I would say it's great theater.
Yeah.
People line up for days in advance for Trump rallies. Trump is very shrewd, and he has studied the Martin Dies playbook well.
Yeah.
He knows to pen the journalists in the corner and to vilify the bad guys. He learned the hard way doing TV, what works and what doesn't. That is great theater. The Democrats don't do great theater. No. They don't see that in their interest. They don't have the charisma to begin with. I would not drive a long way to see a Joe Biden rally, although I will.
He's a lovely man, but
I will crawl on glass to vote for him come November. But theater is important, and mastering theater. Martin Dies was not much of a student, but he went to drama classes to increase his oratorical skills. So it's incumbent upon any politician to understand that politics is theatrical. And in fact, you know, even as you pointed out, the failure of Oscar Eustis to understand what he didn't get at that production of Julius Caesar, what Hallie Flanagan didn't understand when she walked into this old congressional building and squared off against Martin Dies and his colleagues was that their form of political theater was actually more entertaining to the press, to the radio. They knew how to work the media in ways that she didn't realize she had to. So you're asking me questions that are making me think harder about what she might have done differently, but that was not in her toolkit.
One of the contrasts I often make is Brecht's comment, his testimony before the House Committee, before he jumped ship and left. I mean, it just reads like a script. But he danced the circles around them. You know, did you write this play, Mr. Brecht? No, well, I wrote a play in German. It was very different. It was like, you know, he gets the punchline. And it doesn't matter if you win the punchline or win the argument as long as you win the punchline.
Exactly. And Martin Dies would keep circling and circling until he could ask the question that would produce the headlines the next day. And he understood one of the awful things Martin Dies found out in the Federal Theater was there was a musical that had black and white actors, and one of the black actors called one of the white actors and asked her out on a date. And she went ballistic, called her senator, and appeared before the Dies committee excoriating the Federal Theater for encouraging this communist activity of interracial dating. And Martin Dies just knew that was going to light up the press, which it did.
Which brings us back to where we started with that production in Central Park and the still of a fictional Donald Trump as Julius Caesar being killed by
black folk.
By black folk.
Absolutely.
You know, with all the white folk edited out of the frame and
Exactly.
And then setting the narrative. Look, you've set a great narrative here. You've told it. I think you've really put a lot of things in historical context for us. And I think one of the most important things when you're in a moment like the moment we are in democracies all over the world, not just the US, is to understand that moment as having antecedents, as having moments in the past that we can understand our present through. And you've done that brilliantly in the Shakespeare book, and I know you're going to do it brilliantly in the Federal Theatre Project book. I think we want to open it up to the floor for a few questions at this point. If anybody has anything they want to. Now, I am slightly blinded by the light here, but.
Maybe turn up the house lights just a bit so we can see the questions.
I'm going to abuse my position while all of you are considering this extraordinary amount of information you've taken in. I never do this, but there is something I would love to ask Jim. Two things, actually. First, the Federal Theatre is happening at a time when Europe is sliding into fascism, when the Nazis have taken over, moving and finishes just about at the point where we're going into World War II. Is there any evidence that plays arrived at Hallie Flanagan's desk dealing with the collapse of Europe at that time?
That's a great question. And the answer is the first major federal theater play was called Ethiopia. And it was about the dangers of Mussolini invading Ethiopia and the spread of that kind of brutality, kind of a Ukraine moment. And to its great discredit, the State Department and President Roosevelt made clear to the Federal Theater, you will not stage this play. You may not. Because it was going to open on Broadway. And it had tremendous cast, a great Arthur Arendt storyteller, interracial, because they were bringing in black actors to enact the Ethiopians who were destroyed by Mussolini's forces. And they just said, you cannot do it. So 6 months earlier, Harry Hopkins, who was the head of the whole enterprise of providing relief in America, had said, you are going to get a free adult and uncensored theater. First show that comes up, we're censoring you. And that, in a way, shows how difficult it is to do theater in a state-supported way. And Elmer Rice, who was one of the great, great theater people in the United States at this time, quit the Federal Theater, which was a terrible blow to Hallie Flanagan and to the Federal Theater. So they had an empty theater. So what did they put on? To its even greater shame, the first show they put on Broadway was a show about the president of the Confederacy in the South, in which a slave begs his master to keep him enslaved, even though the war is over, because he just loves being a slave. And they put this on Broadway in lieu of Ethiopia. So I'm not trying to celebrate in an uncritical way the Federal Theater. It tried to survive and thrive between the forces that were arrayed against it, governmental and political.
It would be amazing if there weren't attempts to censor it, and indeed self-censorship, as you so eloquently displayed in the case of Liberty Deferred. Certain risks presumably couldn't be taken, but thank you for that answer. You've all had loads of time now to think about this. So.
There's a question 2 rows
Hello?
back.
Yeah.
The man in the green shirt. Just grab the mic. So.
I don't need it.
No, but it's being recorded.
Oh, excuse me. Thank you. It was very eloquent. We could probably have this discussion for the next day or two about fascism in America, because that's what it is. And we're witnessing this. But in a sense, I know this is probably a lengthy answer from your part, but in the midst of all this fascism, racism, intolerance, inability for a dialectic, inability to engage in a conversation, inability of the government to fund arts, that is an open-ended question. How do you find optimism? What's your optimism in this?
I find optimism when I come to rooms like this, where I get to share ideas, where there may be people who fiercely disagree with me, and we get to enact what theater does. And one of the nice things about writing a book and going on the road with it, because it's as important for me to use it as a vehicle to go on the road, is that I get to meet and argue. And I was raised in an argumentative family. I was raised in America that celebrated difference and argument. Not all kinds of difference, but some sorts of difference. So the only optimism I have is it's still possible to publish books like this without being censored, and it's still possible to go out and argue for things like theater to heal a divide, to allow people of differing political viewpoints to sit cheek by jowl. Because I guarantee you that if you made available to the people who traveled 3 days to go to a Trump rally some great theater, they'll go to that too. even if it doesn't necessarily align with their politics, if it opens up to them possibilities that they were unfamiliar with, it moves them somewhat. And I'm not trying for a conversion experience in America. I'm just trying to remind us that it wasn't so long ago that we could speak across a divide. And I'm speaking in an Ireland where you were all aware of what happens when people stop talking and start shooting, or when people stop shooting and start talking. So these are not impossibilities. Is it hard? It's going to be really hard. And I'm counting on a younger generation to act on this, because my generation certainly lost the ball.
Hello?
A question on the back left.
Yeah. You started off talking about the far right who were paid to turn up to the Julius Caesar play. And you talked about the playbook that is there, but it's unwritten and it's unsaid. And here in Ireland, in the last couple of days, we have a small right-wing party who have no elective representatives, who had to disclose that they had 400,000 in gold bars, and they haven't put any accounts into our standards in public office. So how do you help connect the dots or put together that jigsaw that will let people see that this is a playbook and that Steve Bannon was coming to Europe to actually set up a training camp in Rome for the far right in Europe? I think we're not connecting the dots and we're not seeing it. And what would you suggest we
That's
can
a
do?
great question. The best answer I have is to publish, if you will, that right-wing playbook, to say these are the predictable moves. This is what they're going to do next. I'm watching, for those of you also watching what's happening in a once far more democratic Israel, where those on the left are protesting as they're watching a right-wing playbook slowly, gradually, inexorably destroy democracy. You have to be aware of what that playbook is. And Martin Dies, to my mind, is the great creator of the American playbook. So we have to watch what happens when media giants are controlled by individuals who have an investment in eroding democracy. We have to watch when small legislative agendas, or what's happening in local school districts in America, are happening. And you have to see this before it is too late. And if it is too late, then you have to amass even more energy. It's not a complicated playbook. It's just a winning one.
Yeah, and I'm going to add to that what you're probably too modest to say, which is books like yours help us see that playbook, because it's one thing to spell it out in abstract terms. It's much easier to grasp in concrete particulars, a real story. You think, well, that's how it was done, and that's how you see it.
Yeah,
you know?
and part of the problem, one of the things Martin Dies realized was, I can tell lies to the press, and they're not going to follow up, or they're going to bury it on page 36, but they're going to put that interracial dating story on page 1.
Yeah.
And he keeps waiting for pushback that never comes. Yeah. And he says, I can go further than this. You just have to be alert, and you have to call it out, and you have to shame those and stop those who are eroding democratic values. It seems to be very simple, because to my mind, it is very simple, but it takes an awful lot of people to stop what they're doing and protest things that will hurt the world that their children and grandchildren are going to grow up in. I'm shocked to hear how down this is. You know, I don't think of it. I think of it as, in America, we're really at war right now. So I don't feel pessimistic. I just feel this is an at-war situation rather than one in which I'm discouraged.
Yeah, in which a kind of uplifting answer is falsification. Yeah, we have a
gentleman in black.
Thanks so much, both of you, for the conversation. I've read recently on some American theatre Twitter, in the context of, as you alluded to, the downsizing of the public theatre, the cancelling of Under the Radar, the closure of the Mark Taper Forum in LA, and other theatre closures all over the country, that maybe the solution is for Joe Biden to start another federal theatre project. Do you think there's a possibility that might happen, and what could that look like?
There have been calls in Congress for reinstituting a federal theater, and they've gone nowhere, simply because Congress, those on the right in Congress, know how dangerous theater is and know how it can be used to, if you will, educate and move the American people. One of the first people to write about democracy in America was Tocqueville in Democracy in America, his 1835 book, a century before the creation of the Federal Theater. And he said, theater is really dangerous because the pit tells the box seats what is what. It turns the order upside down. And those in power know this. And if you want to control the world you live in and mislead people and keep them happy, you do not expose them to what physically going to the theater and seeing plays entails. And it's no surprise that such a radical play as A Midsummer Night's Dream is outlawed in a school district in Florida, or a whole string of plays is now being outlawed in various parts of America because one play might not have white characters, another play might have incest. That could be Hamlet, for all we know.
Sophocles,
so that the right wing, going back to the playbook question, is realizing and chipping away, even in educational contexts, what theater can do to open up hearts and minds of young people especially. And the situation, there will not be a new federal theater project. I was just doing the math on the Irish initiative to support artists. And were we to do that on the same scale as your 5,000 here, 135,000 American artists would be given money to pursue. That's just so mind-blowing. I can just see the headlines in Fox News tomorrow. You're crying that possibility. Whereas it's below the radar here. Yeah. Sure, we would do that. Why not? That's a good idea.
We should be doing more of it. I think we probably have a chance for one more question. We have two more. We have one gentleman here and then the gentleman in the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shapiro, for a wonderful talk. I'm struck very strongly by the power of the media today. And of course, unfortunately, the media is in private hands by and large. And the concentration of wealth today compared to what it was in the 1930s is such that a small number of people seem to be able to set the agenda, and democracy has been what do I call it, the loser in this situation. Just wanted your comments on that, please.
Sure. The media is always a problem in these situations. At the time of the Federal Theater, the Hearst papers controlled something like 85% of the media in the States. They were the Murdochs of their day, and they railed against the Federal Theater. They actually tried to infiltrate it and had people opening the mail to try to expose what was going on. The media is with us always, and what we have to do is make sure that we don't allow it more power. We don't allow an internet to drive and decide what we think and believe. But collectively, I think that can be overcome with a full acknowledgement that that is part of the playbook. And we just have to keep coming back and saying, I know what you're doing. It's not going to work.
Which, of course, one of the big figures in the Federal Theatre Project, Orson Welles, does with Citizen Kane. Yeah?
Yes, he does. And in fact, one of the most beautiful moments as the Federal Theatre was winding up, Orson Welles gets on the radio and debates 5 congressmen and basically says, you have no idea how stupid it is to cut the arts. You should be ashamed of yourselves. And we no longer have even the possibility of 5 congressmen getting, you know, with Meryl Streep on television and having her chew them out. It's not going to happen. But there are these glorious moments in the late 30s where it did. Let me take a last question.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. My question is, you know how the arts, like the theater art, was getting attacked in the 1930s and was shut down. Do you think other forms of arts, like libraries, because I think last year in America there was a banning of books and that was to do with that information. Just want to hear your thoughts.
It's an interesting question. I think all art has the potential, clearly, to be dangerous and subversive. Otherwise, Hitler would not have burned Jewish art in the 30s, and Ron DeSantis would not be suppressing books in Florida schools. The reason why the Federal Theatre alone, out of all the arts programs in the 1930s, was singled out and denied funding is there's something communal about experiencing theater. Maybe it's in a world in which we don't all go to church every Sunday together, or mosques or synagogues, that it becomes a kind of secular place where we come together. I can't watch plays on television alone. I have to be in a room. And I know tomorrow I'm going to be seeing this spectacular trilogy, and I'm happier that I'm seeing it in Ireland before it comes to New York, because I get to experience it within an Irish context. So I think, truly, theater has the capacity to bring people together in a way that writing, which I love and practice, or painting, or music, can't quite approach.
It also stages a kind of social compact.
Yes.
I am going to sit and listen to you, and if what you've said entertains me and I like it, I'll applaud at the end, and I'm not going to jump up on the stage and smack you in the face.
Although people sometimes at the public theater try to do just that.
Which is where we came in. Jim Shapiro, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Chris.
Thank you.
And thank you, Katrina.
Thank you. Thank you all.